00121. Odin is. Ezekiel and Sanhilder stood in front of the door for Brunhilde's room. Ezekiel had just knocked on it a few moments ago, but heard no response yet. After half a minute of waiting, Ezekiel knocked again, but harder this time. After about a minute, Ezekiel slammed on the door a few times and waited. After another minute without a response, Ezekiel typed an override code into the keypad next to the door. As the door slid fully open, Ezekiel walked inside the room before a bottle flew past his head and slammed into the wall. If someone doesn't answer the door, it means they want to be left alone. Ezekiel glanced to where the bottle came from to see Brunhilde laid back in a chair. Her black hair was unkempt, like she just got out of bed not long ago. Scattered around the room were countless empty bottles while Brunhilde herself was currently drinking from a half-full bottle. Ezekiel smiled towards her as he said, "Hi, my name's Ezekiel. Sorry for the intrusion, but we came a long way to find you." Brunhilde finished her bottle and threw it at Ezekiel before she said, "I don't give a shit who you are or why you're here. Leave." Ezekiel dodged the bottle, and as it shattered on the wall, Sanhilder walked into the room. Brunhilde was in the process of opening another bottle when she froze. Tears started to well up in the corners of her eyes as she glanced at where the bottle just broke, before she asked, "What the hell did I just drink?" Ezekiel stepped out of the way as Sanhilder walked past him towards Brunhilde. Brunhilde finished opening her new bottle and took a long drink before she looked back at Sanhilder. Then Brunhilde shook her head as she said, "I have no idea what tricks you are trying to pull with this, but if you don't stop it now, I'll kill you." Sanhilder had a sad smile as she asked, "What happened to that bright-eyed little girl that used to watch the Valkyries train every day? The one who begged to join the ranks when she came of age?" Brunhilde narrowed her eyes slightly as she studied Sanhilder before she said, "She watched all of her sisters die a pointless death for a worthless king. Including you, ghost." Brunhilde lifted up her bottle and chugged it. Once it was empty, she tossed it to the side and said, "Now it's time for you to go back where you belong, ghost." Brunhilde then glanced at Ezekiel and said, "And I'm going to kill you for whatever this is." Brunhilde stood up from her chair on unstable legs before Sanhilder placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Brunhilde went to knock it off, but Sanhilder caught her hand and said, "Brunhilde, you silly little girl, do I feel like a ghost to you?" The warmth of her hand, the gentle tone of her voice, and the concerned look in Sanhilder's voice made Brunhilde pause. She knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She saw Sanhilder fall herself. But wait, if... She shook her head in denial. Her sisters were dead. She watched them all fall. Sanhilder let go of her arm and placed it lovingly on her cheek as she said, "I'm sorry. If I knew something like this would happen, I shouldn't have sent you away from the battle." Brunhilde's eyes widened slightly, with tears threatening to fall as she asked in a shaky voice, "Then why did you?" "Because I wanted you to live." Brunhilde's voice broke slightly as she asked, "How could I possibly live when everyone I care about is dead?" Sanhilder pulled Brunhilde in a tight hug as she said, "I'm sorry. I didn't think about the consequences of sending you away. It was just my selfish wish that I wanted the youngest of our ranks to live." Ezekiel, standing by the door, could hear Brunhilde softly begin to sob in Sanhilder's arms. He was going to say something when an explosion rocked the whole building, while Brunhilde and Sanhilder were pulled out of their embrace as the window shattered. As an alarm started to blare throughout the building, a group of people flashed into existence next to Ezekiel. Brunhilde, with tears still running down her face, asked, "What's going on?" Darren pointed a finger at someone wearing a white and red fox mask as he said, "We needed a distraction." The man shrugged as he said, "I placed a bunch of explosion tags around the engine core of a ship." Ezekiel smiled as he said over the alarm, "If it works, it works. But we should probably get out of here." Ezekiel glanced at Sanhilder as he said, "Help Brunhilde grab her stuff and we'll leave." Brunhilde's eyes focused a little as she asked, "Where are we going?" "Someplace safe, so that you two can talk." Brunhilde didn't respond as Sanhilder led her to a bedroom area. A few minutes later, both women appeared carrying some bags and Brunhilde had a sword strapped to her hip. As they walked towards Ezekiel, he pushed mana into his bracelet, and a few moments later a silver portal appeared. Back on Earth, the group split up. Ezekiel, his clones, and Darren went back to base to start processing what they recovered from Sakaar, while Sanhilder and Brunhilde were sent to the hidden island so they could talk. Over the next few days, Ezekiel and his clones examined over 100 items and only found a handful of useful things. While some items looked like they could be useful, most of them were too broken to be useful. They could be pulled apart for research and to help advance their technology. But figuring out the original thing it was made to do? Not a chance. Also, one of the items they found ended up being a major disappointment. While it was better than anything currently made on Earth, it's just the fact that it was only a vacuum cleaner that made it. Not great. Ezekiel already set it aside for Tony. He was going to give it to him and let Tony make a new product line with it. Ezekiel would only ask for 1/4 of the profit, or maybe some stock options. Another day passed by before Sanhilder contacted Ezekiel and said she wanted to talk. So Ezekiel met her at the medical base with Tao and Agatha an hour later. When they arrived, Brunhilde seemed to be in better shape than before. Her eyes were clear and focused, while Sanhilder wore a constant frown. After greeting each other and sitting down, Ezekiel asked, "So what can I help you with?" Sanhilder glanced at Brunhilde for a few moments before she looked at Ezekiel and said in a defeated voice, "You were right. Odin pretty much erased us from history along with Hela. Everything we ever did for Asgard, for our people, for our king, just gone." Ezekiel nodded before he asked, "So what do you want to do?" "I don't know. Our purpose was to help protect Asgard and its people. But now..." Ezekiel waited for a few seconds before he said, "I have a few ideas on what you could do if you're interested." When Sanhilder nodded her head, Ezekiel said, "Well, your first option would be to retire." "Retire? A Valkyrie does not retire. We die in combat, so we can go to Valhalla," said Sanhilder. "Option 2 is I give you a ship and you can go out into space. Maybe act as a mercenary company or something, fighting for whoever pays you." "Why would you give us a ship?" Brunhilde asked. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Because I'm a nice guy and believe in karma. We also collected 22 ships while we were on Sakaar. I could easily spare one." Brunhilde looked at Ezekiel as she asked, "You stole ships from Sakaar?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Collected. We collected ships while we were there. We didn't steal anything. In fact, if we didn't collect them, they would have been destroyed in that awful explosion." Brunhilde was going to say something when Sanhilder placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sanhilder nodded at Ezekiel as she asked, "What are your other ideas?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Come work for me and help protect the people of Earth." "And what would we get in return for our servitude?" Ezekiel raised up both hands and waved them in the air as he said, "Back up. I said work for me, not serve me. You could quit working for me whenever you want. You would also be paid, have the best healthcare in the world, dental, vacation and sick pay, maternity leave, free housing, free meals in the commissary, and a bunch of other nice things." Sanhilder glanced at Brunhilde, then back at Ezekiel as she asked, "I'm not exactly sure what most of that stuff is. How much did you make when you worked for Asgard?" Ezekiel asked. "Make?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Yeah. How much did Odin pay you to be a Valkyrie?" "We were given a barracks room inside the palace to stay in, a training field for practice, free food in the mess hall, and access to the healers when needed." Ezekiel frowned as he asked, "What about new weapons and armor? Or just new clothes in general?" "We had access to the forges for armor and weapon repairs. As for clothing, we had our uniforms." Ezekiel glanced at Tal before he asked, "So you were never given gold or any type of currency?" "There was no need. Everything we needed was provided for us." Ezekiel let out a sigh as he asked, "What about time off? Time you could use to go spend with your friends, family, or lovers?" Sanhilder shook her head before she said, "Joining the ranks of the Valkyries meant cutting all family ties. The only family we had after joining was our battle sisters, and we also weren't allowed to be in any type of relationship." Brunhilde nodded in agreement before she said, "As for friends, we had our sisters." Sorry, that just sounds like bullshit to me. Cutting of family ties and not being allowed in relationships? What kind of stupid guidelines are those?" Ezekiel asked. Sanhilder frowned slightly as she said, "They're the rules set down by Odin. Let me guess, you had to be virgins to join the ranks?" Sanhilder looked surprised as she asked, How do you know? Ezekiel dropped his head down on the table as he said, "'Cause that's the kind of bullshit rules a guy who wants a loyal harem of women would make up." Sandhilder shared a look with Brunhilde for a few moments before she said, "Odin wasn't like that." Ezekiel lifted his head up from the table and looked Sandhilder in the eyes as he asked, "You mean the same guy who removed his own daughter from history because it didn't fit the new image he wanted for Asgard?" Ezekiel shook his head and after a few moments said, "How about we get back to what I was originally talking about? I want to offer you and any of your people who wish to join a job. I don't know. I'll need time to think about it. I also need to talk with the others first. I have a lot to discuss with them." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "I understand. Take as long as you want. I already made housing arrangements for you, and everyone else, we just need to wake them up." Ezekiel stood up from his chair as he said, "Follow me, and I'll take you to your sisters." Ezekiel led the group out of the room into a different area of the facility. Inside the new area resting on beds were the rest of the Valkyries. Silent tears ran down Brunhilde's face as she looked at all of her sisters sleeping peacefully. Sandhilder glanced at them all before she asked, "When did you do this?" "My team's been working on this since we brought you back." Sandhilder turned to look directly at Ezekiel as she asked, "And you don't want anything in return?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Like I said before, having some badass warriors owe me a favor in the future would be nice. But no, I'm not expecting anything for doing this." Ezekiel glanced at Tao as he said, "Wake them up, please." Tao started casting a spell, and before long a golden spell thread leaped from her hands and shot towards the closest person. It touched them before going to the next person and the next, until it finally blinked out of existence with the last person. After a few moments, one by one each woman slowly came to and sat up on their beds. After a full minute, they were all awake and looking around in confusion. Some were touching parts of their bodies or looking at limbs in wonder before Sandhilder yelled out, "Valkyries, form lines." Within a few moments, everyone was out of their beds and lining up in ranks without a second thought. Once they were all set up in ranks, Sandhilder turned to Ezekiel and asked, "You said you had a place we could stay?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Follow me, you're gonna love it." 00122. Training Chakra and? After getting the Valkyries settled in Genosha, Ezekiel moved on to his next project, something he accidentally put off for the past couple months, teaching everyone about Chakra. It was a couple days later that Ezekiel and a bunch of his clones met everyone who was given a new body inside the main base's gym. They were located in the main sparring area where bleachers were set up for people to spectate fights. Ezekiel glanced over everyone for a few moments, double-checking that no one was missing. He only wanted to do this once, and then give everyone reading material he made on the subject. He knew he would have to still answer questions sooner or later. But hopefully the cloning project would be finished soon, and he could pawn the work off on other people. Ezekiel put on a smile as he said, "First, I would like to thank everyone for coming. Before I start, does anyone have any questions?" A few people raised their hands, so Ezekiel pointed to one of them as he said, "Go ahead." Sarah glanced at a couple other people around her before she asked, "I want to know why I'm here? I'm not a fighter and don't plan to be one. So do I really need to learn this stuff?" "That's a great question, and honestly, if you don't want to learn it, I won't force you to. But before you leave, let me share a few non-combat related skills you might find useful." Ezekiel hinged into a beautiful long-haired woman in a red dress before he said in a woman's voice, "This skill can be used to change your appearance." Sarah raised an eyebrow as she said, "Which would be great for spying, but I don't plan to be a spy." "True, but you could easily use this to spice up your bedroom activities if you wanted." Ezekiel winked before he transformed back into his normal appearance. Sarah was about to respond when Ezekiel pointed to one of his exact clones and said, "If some role-playing isn't to your liking, maybe a ménage à trois is more interesting instead? You could easily make a clone of yourself." Steve shook his head. While some people seemed interested in the idea, other people like Fury weren't amused at all, including Tao, who said, "I hope you have a point to all of this." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Just giving people ideas to think outside of the box. The things you can do with Chakra and the skills I teach you can be used in a bunch of different ways. You can even come up with new skills once you gain mastery over Chakra control." Ezekiel looked back at Sarah as he said, If you master chakra control, you can use it to help with research projects. Or make clones to help with research in general. Or better yet, use clones to learn faster. Learn faster? Ezekiel pointed at his clones and said, "Every clone I make has my memories when they're created, so they can easily help with anything I need. But the best part is they also send me memories when they dispel. So if one of them reads a book, it's like I read the book myself." "Wait, you share memories with your clones? So you're some kind of hive mind?" asked Bill. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "No, it's just me and copies of me. Once a clone is made, it's a separate copy of me, and I only receive the memories once it's gone." "But what if a clone doesn't want to dispel?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "That doesn't happen. They know they are only a copy and have a limited lifespan." Also, we are getting off topic. Ezekiel looked back at Sarah and said, "Besides what I mentioned, there are a large number of medical applications you can use chakra for. Plus, you can easily come up with your own once you become proficient with chakra. Does that help? Or should I list more reasons?" Sarah shook her head as she said, "No, that's more than enough. Thank you." Ezekiel glanced over everyone as he asked, "Any more questions?" Ezekiel pointed at Clint, who asked, "What exactly is chakra?" Ezekiel scratched the back of his head as he said, "That's a very complicated question that could take days to discuss properly. But the simplest explanation would be supernatural energy you can harness." Anyone else? When no one had any questions, Ezekiel started everyone on the first steps to sensing their own chakra, which only took a few minutes since everyone could easily feel chakra inside their new bodies. The next step was getting everyone to slowly cycle chakra through their pathways. That ended up taking a while, since some people just didn't seem competent at the process. But within a few hours, everyone was able to somewhat cycle chakra throughout their bodies. The next process was pushing a little bit of chakra outside their bodies. That one took even longer, and Ezekiel ended up calling it a day after that. He told everyone to practice cycling chakra throughout their pathways for the next week, and they would try the next step the following week. For the next class, everyone could consistently cycle their chakra throughout their pathways with no real issue. So Ezekiel moved them onto the next step of producing chakra outside of their bodies. It was just a little bit on the tip of each person's finger. This step took the whole day and even the next class before everyone had a decent grasp on the concept. From that point on, the classes ramped up in difficulty, and Ezekiel started training everyone on the leaf-sticking exercise. Too much chakra and the leaf would be destroyed. Too little chakra and the leaf wouldn't stick. Tao and Agatha had the easiest time with the exercise and could easily stick a leaf to their finger after a few minutes. But Ezekiel didn't stop there. He had them do one on each finger after that. It was the same for everyone else once they could do the first leaf. They would add a leaf till their hands were covered in them. Once everyone completed that portion of the training, Ezekiel moved them onto coins. It was the same principle, but with heavier objects this time. He also increased the difficulty by making everyone add a new coin on top of an already stuck coin. It made people have to adapt and find the right balance point to hold the first coin to the second coin. Once they could do it with 2 coins, he added a third, then a fourth and fifth coin. The last step was a stack of coins on each finger on both hands. Once the first person completed that part of training, Ezekiel moved them onto the rock wall. So far, the only people to get that far were Tao, Agatha, and surprisingly Carlson. Their training was to climb the rock wall and only use their hands with chakra control. By the time that part of the training process came up, it was already December, so Ezekiel had his clones decorate the base for the holidays. He also set up a large group trip for all the kids to go to Genosha and have fun at the theme parks. It wasn't just the kids from the base, but also the kids from Xavier's school who were going. It was planned to be a week-long event, and at the end of it, Dazzler and her band were going to have a live concert event broadcasted on Vibe for Christmas Eve. Everything for that went smoothly, and the concert ended up getting over 20 million live viewers, which was surprising for Theo, because that was over a quarter of the user base of Vibe tuning in to watch it. It also gained Dazzler and her bandmates a lot of new fans, and they finally surpassed Kurt with the highest follower count. Well, it was close. They were only a few hundred ahead of him for now. Speaking of Kurt, he recorded a lot of footage while in Genosha, showing off a lot of the country and its advanced technology and city. The videos he uploaded while on vacation ended up being some of his most watched videos. But that might be because everyone was super curious about Genosha, which had very strict immigration and visiting restrictions. So far, only a handful of people have visited Genosha since it was announced to the world. Mostly it was foreign dignitaries that passed the background and psychological checks. So far, there were only 10 people that passed everything, which made a lot of governments unhappy. They even made an official protest to the UN asking for sanctions to be placed on Genosha. Magneto, being the showman he is, went directly to the UN and told everyone who wanted to place sanctions on Genosha to send better representatives. He then posted every person's background and psychological check that failed to enter Genosha online. Needless to say, he ruined a lot of people's careers in less than a day. It also pissed off a lot of people and countries, but Magneto just smiled at the cameras and said, Genosha welcomes everyone and anyone who is open-minded and understands that even though some of us might look different, underneath it all, we're all just human. After that day, no country or government said anything bad about Genosha. At least publicly, that is. A few countries have tried other ways to get into Genosha, but with Tao's magic barrier in place and Theo's control of satellites, no one has been within 100 miles of the island unless they allow it. That didn't stop the United States and a few other governments and groups from trying, though. The US attempted it the most, though, with 10 by water and 20 by the air. They finally stopped when one of the jets they tried to fly towards Genosha disappeared, and the pilot ended up appearing out of thin air, confused in the middle of the command center. SHIELD also tried to enter Genosha, but they lost 2 planes before they stopped. It wasn't on Fury's orders either, but on Alexander Pierce's and the WSC. The pilots from the first one were returned to a random SHIELD base, while the second plane was flown remotely. After that, the rest of the world stopped trying to enter the area around Genosha. 00123. Wait, what happened? After a quiet Christmas with his family, Theo brought forth a question he was putting off asking. The game that he made with Peter and Millie was basically done. They had a survival mode, creative mode, along with multiplayer functionality built in. Theo just needed to make a website and launch the game now. Once that was done, his company would quickly find it and buy the game. At least that was the plan anyway. He planned ahead and already read books from the library on how to code and build websites. He even shared them with Peter, and they practiced building websites on their computers. The main problem now was convincing his parents to let him build a website. If he was older, it might not be an issue, but with his age, he was concerned they would reject the idea. It was a typical Sunday morning for their family when Theo brought up the idea during breakfast. As they were eating, Theo asked, "Mom, can I make a website so I can sell my game?" Daniel turned from feeding Isaac and asked, "You want to sell your game?" Theo nodded his head as he said, "Yeah, like they do in the stores." Jacob patted Theo's shoulder as he said, "There is a lot more that goes into selling video games in the store. Pretty sure you have to work with a company to do that, and that company will package your game so it can be sold. But in the book I read, it said you can sell stuff directly from websites. People could download the game directly from the site. The website would be like a store, but only for my game." Daniel smiled as she asked, "What about advertising for the game?" Theo feigned ignorance as he asked, "What's that?" Daniel fed Isaac another spoonful of food before she said, "It's what companies do so people learn about the product or service they're trying to sell." "Oh, I guess that makes sense. People won't buy it if they don't know about it." Theo looked up at his dad as he asked, "But didn't you and Uncle Ben say you don't advertise your business?" Jacob smirked before he said, "We have a very large customer base and a backlog of orders. Plus our customers tell their friends, which brings in more business. Can I do the same? I just make the site and if people like it, they'll buy it." Daniel nodded as she asked, "So you think people will buy the game if you make a nice enough website to attract customers?" Theo shook his head before he said, "The website would have some info about the game and a free creative mode people could download and try out. If they like creative mode, they can buy the game itself." "What's creative mode?" Jacob asked. Millie waved her fork around in the air as she said, "Oh, Millie knows. You get a bunch of different colored blocks to play with, and you can fly around and build stuff. I made a giant birthday cake in it." Theo chuckled a little as he said, "That pretty much sums up creative mode. Instead of all the core features of the main game, creative mode is for people to mess around and build stuff. Peter and I made a scale replica of the shop in it. We also built copies of our houses you can walk around in. Millie nodded along before she said, I made giant cupcakes and cookies over the houses. Daniel smiled before she said, I'd like to see this creative mode you made. Is it on the home computer? Theo nodded his head as he said, Yeah, we have a copy of it on there. All right, since you finished eating, go load it up and show it to me and your dad. Theo nodded before he got up and put his dishes into the sink. Then he headed to the living room and booted up the computer and loaded up a copy of Creative Mode. It was used by Millie a few times, so there were giant cakes, cupcakes, and cookies randomly around the spawn area. There was also a decent-looking statue of Liberty Theo made. After a few minutes, Daniel came out carrying Isaac. She took a seat next to Theo as she said, All right, show me this demo you want people to try out. As Theo started to explain Creative Mode and demonstrated how it worked to his mother, Jacob walked out of the kitchen with Millie trailing behind him. Millie started to excitedly point at the screen, telling Theo to show off her cupcakes. But what caught his parents' eyes was the Statue of Liberty sitting off to the side. You can make stuff like that in Creative Mode? Daniel asked in surprise. You can make pretty much whatever you want as long as you take your time. Theo said, Anything? Theo nodded as he said, Yeah, at least I think you can. After checking out Creative Mode for a little while, Daniel said, All right, you can make a website. But you know they cost money to host and run, right? Theo nodded as he said, It was in the book I read. Not really sure how that all works, though. It's fine. I'll look into it tomorrow. I'll also look into a merchant processor for your website. Daniel said, A merchant processor? What's that? Daniel stood up as she said, It's so you can take in money when you sell your game. The rest of the day was spent together as a family, going to the park, playing board games, and just enjoying each other's company. The next day, since the kids were still out of school for winter break, Theo, Millie, and Isaac went a maze along with their mother. They met Peter there, and Theo had him help build a website for the game. It took them a few days to build and test, but at the end of the week, with the help of his mom, the website launched. Theo also back-tested everything with his clones after launch, and once satisfied everything worked correctly, he left it alone to do other stuff, like working on his go-kart. While Theo was busy with school, working on his go-kart and helping his dad out around the shop, a few people found his website and tested out Creative Mode. While Theo never advertised his game, or even used his clones and vibe to push the website to people, he did optimize the back end of the website to work really well with search engines. So it was no surprise that people found the site the same day it launched. The only problem was one of the people who found it. They were a user of his Vibe platform, and while not very famous yet, they still had a small following. So after they found the website and tested out Creative Mode for a while, they uploaded a video titled, Check out this free building game. In the gameplay video, they built a bunch of random art pieces and some famous buildings. That simple video spread quickly, and within a week, over 30,000 people visited the website and downloaded the demo. But the bigger surprise was that over 1,000 people bought the game for its $25 price tag. During that time, more videos were made with people showing off all the cool stuff they made in Creative Mode, which made more people become aware of the game. But the thing that made the game really take off was a new video by the first person who posted about the game. After their first video in Creative Mode, they bought the game and spent the past week playing Survival Mode. Their Survival Mode video, called Get This Green Thing Away From Me, literally exploded in popularity and tripled their follower count within a few days. The video was so popular it ended up on the front page of Vibe, and things just took off from there. By the end of the month, the number of people who purchased the official game was a little over 100,000 and counting. Since Theo worked so hard to automate Vibe and everything else, he didn't know how popular his game had become. When he wasn't in school, at his father's shop, or spending time with family, he would be training in magic with Tao and Agatha, training people in chakra control, or visiting Tony and working on Jarvis or the cell phone project. The first person in the family who found out the game blew up was Daniel when she received a call from the bank asking if she wanted to invest some of the money in her bank account into some stocks or bonds. At first, she was confused, since one bank account was used for the business and was also cash-heavy to help run the business. The other two accounts were for the family expenses and Theo's account for his game. At first, she thought they were talking to her about the business account, but after talking to the banker for a few minutes, she realized they were talking about Theo's account. At that point, she asked, How much is currently in the account? It looks to be just over $2.5 million. The banker said, "Oh, wait, how much?" The banker could be heard typing before she said, "It's currently at $2,552,850, with another $120,600 in pending deposits." "Are you sure it's that much?" Daniel asked in surprise. "Yes, Mrs. Mercer." "Okay, I'll have to get back to you on this. Thanks for the information," Daniel said quickly before she hung up the phone. Daniel was stunned for a little while before she went to her computer and checked out Theo's website. He left her a login so she could check the back end of the site and see how much traffic the site received over the past month. It also shows how many people downloaded the game demo and how many people bought the game itself. The numbers just reinforced that her son, at almost 8 years old, became a millionaire. While she was on the site, she also checked out the forums that Theo made and saw post after post of people talking about the game and sharing things they created so far. Hundreds of screenshots of beautiful art people made using creative mode, while people on survival mode shared guides on how to survive, what to look out for, how to craft certain items. Daniel couldn't help but smile as she scrolled through posts of people praising whoever made the game. She also found a post from the Vibe user who posted the first video about the game. She ended up watching the video on Vibe and then checked out the user's profile and realized the reason the game became popular was because of all the videos this person made. They currently had 6 videos all about Theo's game, and each video had at least 1 million views, with one video having over 5 million. Daniel closed down the computer and then made a few phone calls to May, Mary, and Sarah. She invited the whole family over for dinner that night and said she had an announcement to make. After that, she ordered pizza to be delivered for dinner and then went to the store to get a few things. A few hours later, Jacob came home with the kids, and a little after that, everyone else showed up to the house. Once everyone was there, Daniel pulled Theo, Peter, and Millie to the middle of the room. She wore a big smile as she said, "Sorry for all the secrecy today, but I wanted everyone to find out at the same time. Now everyone knows Theo, and these two created a game and even made a website so people could buy it. I didn't think much about it till I received a call from the bank today about Theo's bank account." Jacob smiled as he asked, "Someone bought Theo's game? That's great. How much did he make?" "Someone bought the game already?" Theo asked excitedly. Daniel smiled down at Theo before she patted his head and said, "Yup, you actually have a pretty big fan base. A lot of people really like your game." Theo glanced up at his mom as he asked, "A lot of people? So like 100 people?" Daniel shook her head before she said, "More. A lot more." "A thousand?" Theo asked. Daniel pushed Theo gently towards the computer and said, "Go check the website, so everyone can see how many people like your game." As Theo turned on the computer, everyone came close and started to crowd around to see the screen. As Theo was logging into the computer, Jacob asked Daniel, "So Theo sold over 1,000 copies of the game? That's a pretty good start for his college fund." Daniel smiled as she pointed at the screen that Theo just pulled up and waited. Everyone was quiet as they looked at the number on the screen that was currently going up by 2 or 3 new sales every minute or so. Jacob counted it a few times before he asked, "Theo's a millionaire? 00124. Dinner and a movie?" Later that night after the party, Theo made a bunch of clones and had them all look into why the game became so popular and to check the forums. Theo quickly found the reason for the unexpected success, so he had all the clones focus on the forums. His main goal was to read all the forum posts and see what people were saying about the game and see if anyone found any bugs. It took a few hours, but when his clones finished, Theo found that everyone was pretty happy with the game and that so far no bugs were reported. Then he double-checked all the back-end he did for the site and merchant services. He set the site up to hide all his and his family's information. Even the merchant processor was controlled by him. It took a while for the funds to land in the bank account his mom set up, but it was set that way so no one could trace the money to his family. As for the IRS, his mom thought the merchant processor would take care of it all like it normally should. But Theo routed it so it only looked like he paid it, and then took that money and made it look like more people bought games. After that, he focused on his training for the night and had his clones work on the next major patch for the game. He would work on it with Peter and Millie, but with how successful it was, he wanted to sell it to Vibe sooner than he originally planned. He also planned to start his next project to help out his family. The next day, Jacob was still surprised at how popular Theo's game was and double-checked over breakfast a few times with Daniel that Theo was a millionaire. After breakfast, Theo went to his father's shop for the day to help out, along with Peter. While they were there, Theo brought up an idea to Peter while they were helping out and said, "We should make something to help out Dad and Uncle Ben." Peter glanced over to Theo as he asked, "What can we make them?" "We should make them a program to help out in the shop, and that could tie into a website." "Aren't we going to make an update for the game soon?" Peter asked. Theo shook his head before he said, "The game just came out. We can wait a while before we add more content. People haven't even found any of the fun content yet." Peter nodded along before he asked, "Well, what exactly is the new program supposed to do for the shop?" "You've seen how Dad and Uncle Ben work with customers on new projects, right?" Peter shook his head, so Theo said, "They do everything on paper. They write out what exactly the customer wants in the build. The type of engine, if it needs to be stock or tuned, paint job, tires, rims, upholstery types and colors. Pretty much anything that the customer wants for the build." Theo glanced at Peter as he said, "I want to make a program that a customer can use on the website. They would be able to customize their build, and then we could see it in the shop. Like a 3D model of the car they want? Can we even do something like that?" Theo shrugged as he said, "Only one way to find out." Theo and Peter spent the rest of the day brainstorming ideas, and when they got home, Theo wrote the ideas down in a design document. Later that night, when he made clones, he had them start on the project. While he planned to make it with Peter, there was no reason he couldn't cheat a little. Once his clones started to work on the project, he changed into Ezekiel and asked Tao to teleport him to Hell. Within half an hour, a portal opened up in Hell, and Ezekiel stepped through it holding a pizza box. He waved at Hela as he said, "Sorry for not visiting sooner. I was busy with a bunch of projects." Hela looked at Ezekiel as she said, "I honestly wasn't sure if you would be back or not." "Why would you think that?" Hela turned back to the screen, which was playing a documentary about World War II, as she said, "I figured after you obtained the Soul Sphere and showed me how my life will most likely end, you would have no reason to come back." Ezekiel shook his head slightly as he said, "I told you. I came here to make a friend." Hela glanced back at Ezekiel as she asked, "Why would you wish to make friends with me when you already know how my life will most likely end?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Because that's just the type of person I am." Ezekiel pulled out a scroll and poured some chakra into it, which popped out a chair, a table, an ice chest, and a small ring. He placed the pizza box on the table and moved the chair next to Hela. As he moved the table next to her, she asked, "What exactly are you doing?" "I was planning to hang out for a bit and watch a movie or two with you." "Well, unless you don't want to do that." Hela glanced at the table, the ice chest, the ring, and the pizza box as she asked, "And what are those for?" Ezekiel turned to Hela as he said, "Well, I figured pizza and a movie is always a good combination." Ezekiel turned and looked Hela directly in the eyes before he said, "But before that, I have to ask you one very important thing." Hela tensed slightly at his gaze as Ezekiel turned completely serious and asked, "Do you poop?" Hela froze as her mind blanked out. As Hela tried to process just why Ezekiel asked that question, Ezekiel said, "I didn't mean in general, I mean here. You've been trapped here for centuries with nothing to eat and no real way to go to the bathroom. Unless—" "I do not," Hela snapped, before she said, "If you must know, being in hell not only keeps me alive, but relieves me of the burden of needing to do normal things, like eat, sleep, or bodily functions." Ezekiel nodded before he said, "I thought as much. I just wanted to check first." Ezekiel picked up the ring on the table and said, "Give me your hand so I can give you this ring." Hela glanced at the ring for a few moments before she asked, "Why?" Ezekiel held up the ring as he said, "It's a minor magic item that gives the user limited telekinesis. It's so you can eat if you want to." Hela glanced at the ring Ezekiel was holding with some caution before she asked, "How do I know that's not meant to enslave me after I put it on?" Ezekiel gave her a flat look as he asked, "You think I would put this much effort into trying to enslave you?" Hela shrugged slightly as she said, "Maybe." Ezekiel smirked before he said, "Well, if I don't give you the ring, how will you eat some of the pizza I brought? Or would you like me to feed it to you instead?" Hela turned back to the screen as she said, "I don't want any pizza." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, just means more for me, I guess. Ezekiel sat down in his seat and opened the ice chest to pull out a bottle of root beer, which he opened and took a sip from. After he placed the bottle down, he touched a mark on the pizza box which seemed to unseal it. A moment later, Hela could smell a fresh bread-like aroma with a hint of cheese and meat. Ezekiel opened the box and pulled out a steaming slice of pizza topped with a bunch of meat. As he pulled the slice away, the cheese stretched slightly and became stringy. Hela also noticed a red sauce-like substance underneath the cheese and meat. As Ezekiel folded his slice and took a bite, Hela couldn't help but watch. After Ezekiel finished his first bite, he turned to see Hela watching him. He smiled as he asked, "Are you sure you don't want to try some?" Hela glanced at the pizza again before she said, "Fine, I'll try pizza." A second later, Hela struggled to raise her hand out of the chains so Ezekiel could place the ring on her finger. After her hand disappeared into the chain, she asked, "How do I use the ring?" "Just think that you are using your hand to do stuff, and the ring will take care of the rest." Hela looked down at the pizza, and a second later a piece pulled away from it and floated in the air. Then it folded slightly and moved to Hela's mouth, where she took a bite from it. She showed almost no outward emotions, but Ezekiel thought her eyes lit up just a little as she ate her first bite. When she finished that bite, she asked, "Is this normal for Midgardian food?" "What do you mean?" Hela glanced at the pizza before she asked, "Is most Midgardian food a mix of different ingredients?" "When I last traveled there, grilled or smoked meat seemed to be the food of choice. We've evolved a long way since then, and everything else about us also evolved with us," Ezekiel said as he pointed at the war documentary on the screen. Ezekiel glanced at Hela for a moment before he asked, "Want to watch a good movie?" "I've already seen the movies you recommended. What would we watch?" Hela asked before she took another bite of her pizza. "Play the movie, Back to the Future," said Ezekiel. As the movie started, Ezekiel opened up another root beer and placed it next to Hela as he said, "In case you want to try a drink from Midgard." Over the next few hours, Ezekiel and Hela ate pizza, drank root beer, and watched a couple movies until Ezekiel needed to go back home. As he was packing up to leave, Ezekiel said, "I'll try to come back sooner next time." Hela nodded before she asked, "Will you bring more pizza and root beer?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Possibly, but there are many different types of food I can bring that you'll probably enjoy. So how about I bring something new each time I visit to keep things interesting?" After thinking about it for a few moments, Hela said, "That would be acceptable." As a portal opened up, Ezekiel said, "Great, I'll see you next time." After the portal closed, Hela let out a sigh before she looked at the screen, which was currently paused. She wouldn't admit it, but it was nice to eat food and watch a movie with Ezekiel. A new experience in this place was rare. Well, with the device to watch or read human entertainment, it wasn't as boring as it used to be. But Ezekiel seemed to make the place a little more bearable to be trapped in. 00125. New members again, and over the next couple of months, Theo settled into a new routine during the weekdays. He would go to school, and after school, he would help out at his dad's shop till close. Then he would come back home and work on his new project for a little while after dinner, before spending time with his family and then going to bed. Well, he would send a clone to bed while he trained in the mystic arts and sent clones to the base to train people in Chakra. On Mondays, he would portal to Tony's workshop and work on stuff with him. Mostly, it was double-checking everything for the phone project, which was almost set to launch. Theo just wanted to make sure they had everything ready to go and enough phones to meet demands. They projected to sell at least 100 million phones in the first month and expected to reach 500 million by the end of the year. Were they being optimistic? Not really. Since they planned everything perfectly, Tony would hold a launch event and give all the reporters and celebrities who show up a top-tier phone. Theo also planned to give phones to popular people on Vibe, like Kurt, Kitty, Dazzler, and others. At least that was the plan so far. They would need to iron everything out as they got closer to launch. Then, a week later after the launch event, the phones would be released to the general public for purchase. That way, the general public would be hyped for the phone that everyone was talking about. Besides working on the phone project, Theo also helped Tony work on Jarvis, which was almost done at this point. Jarvis was currently working, and Tony was already happy with it. But Theo knew it could be better and was improving the code every day. His plan was to make Jarvis a pseudo-AI for now, and see if he can awaken to full sapientance on his own. If not, Theo would help him out in 5 to 10 years. Going back to Theo's weekly routine, on Fridays, he would go to Hell and hang out with Hela for a few hours. They mostly ate food and watched movies or TV shows together. But they also played some board games together a few times. But Risk and other strategy-based games were banned after only playing one game because Hela took them a little too seriously. As for the weekends, Theo spent some Saturdays helping out at his dad's shop and also racing his go-kart for an hour or two with Peter. They didn't have a track, but would set up cones in the yard and race around that. Millie would join in sometimes, but she wasn't a big fan of go-karts, unfortunately. On the Saturdays, they didn't help out at the shop. They would work on the new program they were making for the shop. That project was a secret, though, and when asked what they were working on, Peter and Theo would tell their parents it was an update for their game. On Sunday, Theo would spend the day with his family. They would always visit the park for a few hours that day, but would also do other things together. Sometimes, their extended family would join them, and they would end the day with a barbecue or some other type of large group activity. As for the secret organization, a few important things happened during that time. Sanhilder contacted Theo and asked if they could join. After living on Earth for a few months, they decided to make it their new home, but more than that, most of them were bored. So Sanhilder approached Theo about possibly joining the group and what would be involved if they did. Theo laid out what he expected from them and what they would get from them in return. The Valkyries would gain citizenship in Genosha with a place to live, a monthly salary, full medical care, dental, vision, and a 401k. They would also get the best weapons and armor magic and technology could provide. In return, they would work in secret with the organization and could stay as long as they liked. Their main job at first would be helping the group clean up Earth and make it a better world. After that, they would help protect Earth from otherworldly threats. Sanhilder agreed to the terms easily enough, and then Theo held a meeting to make sure everyone else was fine with them joining. When Theo called the meeting together as Ezekiel, Fury was the first one to show up and asked, "Finally gonna tell us about those women you sent to Genosha?" Ezekiel smiled slightly before he said, "How long have you known about them?" "An hour after they appeared on Genosha." Ezekiel shook his head before he asked, "You never brought them up before. Why do you think this meeting was about them?" Fury sat down in his chair as he said, "Because you called an unscheduled meeting to discuss something. It was either them or something new and important." Ezekiel nodded in understanding before he said, "Well, you're correct. But let's wait for the others to discuss it more." After a quick nod, Fury turned to his personal computer and started working on something while people began entering the room. Peggy, Steve, Bill, Alexei, Tao, Agatha, and Jarvis walked into the room before Fury finally asked, "When are we going to start discussing plans about taking down Hydra?" Ezekiel let out a tired sigh before he said, "When we have more info and manpower. WEL, mostly more info, since I keep finding more and more people who are part of Hydra. I swear these people are worse than cockroaches. Aren't we just giving them more time to grow and recruit more people by being so passive?" Steve asked. Fury shook his head as he said, "Maybe, but if we don't take them out by the roots, something like this could happen again. So being cautious is our best course of action. I just want to start laying out some groundwork with the information we already have." Peggy nodded in understanding before she asked, "Is that what this meeting is about?" Ezekiel shook his head before he pulled up some info on the main screen. It was some historical documents about Valkyries along with some old artwork. Ezekiel nodded towards the screen as he said, "It's about that." Bill glanced over everything before he asked, "Why do you want to talk about Norse mythology?" Fury looked directly at Ezekiel as he asked, "Those women are from Asgard?" "What women?" Jarvis asked. "The group of over 1,000 women who showed up on Genosha a few months ago," Peggy said. Ezekiel pulled up some photos of the women on Genosha before he said, "These women were the Valkyries of Asgard over 1,000 years ago before they were killed. They look to be in good shape for being dead." Bill said. Fury focused on Ezekiel as he asked, "You made them new bodies?" "Yup. Through a weird quirk of fate, their souls weren't allowed to move on, and I used that to my advantage. But that also brings me to the main issue for this meeting. I offered them a spot to join us, and they accepted," Ezekiel said. Peggy turned to glare at Ezekiel as she asked, "Why'd you do that? We should have voted before you offered them something like that." Isn't that why you made this council in the first place? To not make unilateral decisions for the group? Fury and Steve also turned to Ezekiel looking for answers. Ezekiel raised his hands up as he said, "Normally I would. But I made the offer with a few others, which I thought they would pick instead. When their leader came and asked for more details about working with us, I told her, and she instantly accepted on the spot." Tao nodded in agreement as she said, "I was there when he made the offer, and I also thought they would pick one of the better offers he gave them." Fury narrowed his eyes a little as he asked, "Can we really trust them, though? They're Asgardian soldiers. They should be loyal to Asgard, not Earth." Ezekiel pulled up some info as he said, "They no longer care about Asgard after the king erased them from the history books. He wanted to cover up certain things about Asgard's past, and that made the Valkyries pretty upset when they found out." Ezekiel then shook his head as he said, "Plus they were pretty much the king's slaves. He was raising them to be his personal harem of virgin warrior women." Fury raised a single eyebrow as he said, "Leaving that information aside, we still need to be able to trust these people we know next to nothing about. How can we do background checks on them if they lived on another planet? They are honor-bound warriors. All we have to do is have them swear loyalty to the organization, and we won't have any issues." Tao said. Fury was skeptical as he asked, "You think a little oath is going to make sure they stay loyal?" Peggy and a few others nodded in agreement before Ezekiel said, "Actually, that would work. They'd rather die than dishonor themselves. And considering they're all over 1,000 years old or more, I think it'll be fine. Plus, where are we going to find another group of fighters with that much experience? Didn't you say they all died at some point? How good of fighters can they be?" Alexei asked. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "They were sent to hold off one of the strongest Asgardian gods that even Odin was afraid of, while Odin sealed them all away. It worked, but all of them died in the process. And if you want to compare strength, a normal Asgardian is stronger than Steve in his old body." Bill looked a little surprised as he asked, "Wait, you mean to tell us Nordic gods are real?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Pretty much. But you can think of them as a god with all lowercase letters in the name. Or just like an overpowered metahuman." Fury glanced at Steve for a moment before he said, "That doesn't matter as much as you just let over 1,000 super soldiers walk around Genosha with no guards for the past few months and didn't even bother to inform anyone." "No, I knew about them, along with Tao, Agatha, and Magneto. Plus, I trusted them to behave themselves. They have had absolutely no issues since they've been on the island." Ezekiel said. Fury frowned as he said, "You still should have informed us about them. The only reason I didn't is because I thought they were going to leave the planet. Besides, Tao or Agatha could easily handle all of them if something happened. So why make a big deal out of it in the first place and have you waste time thinking up contingency plans for no reason?" Ezekiel said as he crossed his arms over his chest and looked back at Fury. "Well, those contingency plans would have come in handy now that they want to stay here." Fury said. Tao glanced at Fury and Ezekiel before she asked, "Can you two stop acting like children and let us move on to why we were called here?" Fury shot another glance at Ezekiel as he said, "We are going to continue this talk later." Ezekiel rubbed the bridge of his nose before he said, "All right, the main reason I called you here is to vote on letting the Valkyries join us. All in favor?" Ezekiel did a quick glance around the room to see that everyone voted in favor of them joining, even Fury. As he was about to end the meeting, Hank Pym ran into the room and said, "We did it. It's stable." Bill stood up from his seat as he asked, "Did the test work on the first try?" Hank nodded as he said, "The quantum tunnel is working perfectly." 00126. A talk with Hank and entering the quantum realm. After everyone was caught up to speed on Hank's team finishing the quantum tunnel, they moved on to who was joining the team to help find Hank's wife. Hank wanted to do it alone or with Darren helping him, but Ezekiel shut that idea down quickly. Hank was seated next to Ezekiel, not looking pleased as Ezekiel asked, "Who wants to go on a rescue mission?" Agatha raised her hand as she said, "I'll go. I want to test a few things there with spellcasting. You can do research another time. The priority of this trip is finding Janet." Hank said in a huff. Steve raised his hand as he said, "Peggy and I would like to join." Peggy nodded in agreement before Ezekiel said, "Great. With a few of my clones joining, that should be more than enough. Ezekiel turned to Tao as he asked, "Did you finish that spell I asked about?" Tao nodded as she said, "Finished it about a year ago with Agatha's help. She'll cast it on everyone before they leave. We also made a couple magic device barriers to place in front of the tunnel and one at the emergency exit." Magic devices and spells? Why do we need anything like that? Hank asked. Ezekiel glanced at Hank as he said, "Think of it as a type of biological filter, but using magic. We have no idea what is in the quantum realm, and I don't plan to bring back something that starts a zombie apocalypse." Everyone turned to look at Ezekiel as Fury said, "You better be joking." "Unfortunately, I'm not. In a different reality, Hank goes to find Janet, but she's a zombie. She infects Hank, then they come back to Earth and the world basically ends before a bunch of super-powered zombies wipe out the rest of the universe." Ezekiel glanced around the room before he said, "We shouldn't have to worry about that happening since Hank was supposed to find his wife in about 16 years or so and she was not a zombie. That said, we're not taking any chances." Ezekiel glanced at Hank as he said, "Let's finish this meeting up and then we need to have a chat about a few things." Hank nodded his head as Ezekiel turned to Tao and asked, "You'll plan to be in Genosha and act as an emergency exit for them, if they need it, right?" "It's the main reason Agatha's going to the quantum realm." "Perfect. I think that's about it. Does anyone have anything to add?" Ezekiel asked as he looked around the room. When no one spoke up, Ezekiel glanced at Steve and Peggy as he said, "Go with Tao and Agatha. They've been working on some special suits to help protect everyone in the field. You'll get to be the test subjects for the trial run." As everyone started to leave the room, Hank and Fury stayed back. Ezekiel waited for the room to clear out before he asked, "Could you leave the room for a bit?" "Fury, I need to discuss something personal with Hank." Fury gave a curt nod as he said, "Find me later. We have a few things to talk about." After Fury left the room, Ezekiel turned to Hank and said, "I didn't bring this up before since it wouldn't have been productive to your work, but I need to tell you about a possibility that might have happened." Hank's face was schooled, but there was a serious glint in his eyes as he focused on Ezekiel, who said, "There is a chance that Janet might be in a relationship with someone else in the quantum realm." Ezekiel watched the shocked look of betrayal cross Hank's face before he narrowed his eyes and said, "Janet wouldn't do that." Ezekiel raised his arms up as he said, "Maybe not yet, but at some point after she gives up hope of ever coming back to Earth, well, she makes a new life for herself in the quantum realm." Ezekiel watched Hank for a few moments before he said, "I would have told you sooner, but I didn't want you to stress over something that might not happen." Hank's tone of voice was low as he asked, "And you think I won't stress over it now? The possibility that she could leave me for someone else? And this is why I didn't tell you sooner. Just know if it hasn't happened yet, it never will." "And how would you know?" Hank asked with heat in his voice. Ezekiel let out a sigh before he said, "Because of the circumstances. She has the chance to escape the quantum realm with the help of someone else. The problem is that person would also be free of the quantum realm." Ezekiel typed on his computer and pulled up some info along with a picture of someone as he said, "This man is Kong the Conqueror. A very nasty version of him is currently trapped in the quantum realm." Hank read the info on the screen before he asked, "So she has a chance to escape by working with this guy?" Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Pretty much. Only she doesn't know the type of person he is until they finish fixing his time sphere. When she finds out, she destroys its power source and gives up any hope of ever leaving the quantum realm." "And that's when she starts another relationship?" Hank asked. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I'm not 100% sure when it happens. Could be right afterwards or in a few years. I'm going to punch you in the face when I meet the real you. You know that, right?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Sure, but you know you'll be punching a child, right?" "That's fine with me. Are we done here?" Hank asked. Ezekiel closed down his computer before he said, "Pretty much. I'll send my clones to join you in your lab in about a few hours or so." A second later, Ezekiel turned into a cloud of smoke, leaving Hank alone with his thoughts. VVVVV. A couple hours later, Minato, Tobarama, and a man with bright red hair walked into Hank's lab. Inside the lab near the back was a small ship designed to transport up to 10 people into the quantum tunnel, which was currently open in front of the ship and painted the area around it in a golden light. Off to the side was Bill and Darren along with Eric, who were at workstations monitoring the portal, while Hank, Agatha, Ebony, Steve and Peggy were off to the other side talking about something. Minato and his group made a beeline towards Hank and the others who were wearing some slick-looking black and gray bodysuits. Once they were close, Minato said, "Sorry for the delay, everyone. We were making something." "About time you showed up," Hank said with a huff. Steve smiled as he asked, "It's fine. We just arrived a few minutes ago ourselves. And I just finished setting up the barrier," Agatha said. Minato smiled back before he looked at the red-haired man as he said, "Great, and let me introduce you to someone. This is Ashina Uzumaki." Steve reached out and shook Ashina's hand as he said, "It's nice to meet you." Ashina smiled as he said, "Same to you." After the others introduced themselves, Peggy said, "I'm surprised Ezekiel is sending someone new with us. I expected Itachi, Shursui, Kakashi, or maybe Sakumo. Ezekiel wants to deal with Kong while we are in the quantum realm, so he sent a sealing master." Peggy and Steve both turned to look at Minato as Peggy asked, "Who's Kong?" Minato smiled as he rubbed the back of his head and said, "Oh, I forgot you weren't briefed about him." Hank stepped in between everyone as he said, "You can talk about Kong once we're in the quantum realm. Let's get going." Steve gave Hank a questioning look as he asked, "What's the hurry? It's not like a couple extra minutes will matter." Hank frowned as he said, "It actually might, so we need to go now." Steve and Peggy tensed up slightly as Steve asked, "What happened? Is your wife in danger? Does it involve this Kong person?" "It's personal. Now if you're coming, get on the ship. Otherwise, I am leaving without you," Hank said as he moved towards the ship they were using to enter the tunnel with. "Wait, let me set up the proper spells," Agatha said as Hank continued to move towards the ship. When he didn't stop on his own, she pointed a finger at him and an orange spell chain shot out and wrapped around him, locking him in place. Hank wanted to say something, but the spell binded his mouth also. Agatha walked in front of him and said, "I don't know why you're in such a hurry, but we are doing things properly. After I place spells on everyone, we will leave. If you understand, nod your head once." Hank glared at Agatha, but nodded his head once. Agatha smiled before she said, "Good boy." Agatha then began to cast a spell which she quickly weaved with her hands, and after about a minute of chanting, the spell expanded out and clocked everyone going into the quantum realm. She then looked at the others as she said, "Now we can go." As the others moved towards the ship, Agatha turned back to Hank and finally released the spell. Once released, she said, "I know Ezekiel probably told you something, and that's why you're all riled up right now and in a rush. But there are more important things going on with this trip than just finding your wife. Keep that in mind going forward, or I'll lock you up in the ship when we get there." Hank glared at Agatha for a few more moments before he exhaled slowly and then said, "Sorry. I just need to find my wife as soon as possible. And you will, but only if you don't try to rush us before we're ready." Hank nodded as Minato stuck his head out the ship's hatch and asked, "What's the hold-up? I thought you were in a rush?" Agatha smiled as Hank frowned, and she said, "We're coming. Get buckled in." After getting into the ship, Hank sat in the pilot seat and started to go over a pre-flight check with Darren over a radio. After a few minutes, Hank flipped the last switch and the ship lifted off the ground with some anti-grav tech they found on Sakar. He glanced back at the others as he said, "Engage your helmets just in case." Before his own helmet covered his head. The clones were the only ones without helmets, which was fine since they didn't breathe air. A few seconds later, Hank guided the ship slowly through the quantum tunnel entrance. As the ship entered the tunnel, the cockpit of the ship lit in a swirl of rainbow colors, and within a moment the ship vanished from the lab. After a few moments, Eric let out a whistle before he asked, "Did you see the data from Monitor 2? Is that real?" Bill patted Eric's shoulder as he said, "Welcome to Super Science, kid. You'll be seeing a lot more stuff like this in the future." 00127. Exploring the quantum realm. It didn't take long for their ship to make it into the quantum realm, since the quantum tunnel acted like a direct portal into it. Once inside, Hank landed the ship on the first flat surface he found, which ended up being right below the ship. It was a weird flat area of gray and purple stuff that looked like grass. In the distance from where they landed, spread throughout the grass were many small and large piles of rocks. The sky above them was painted from purple to dark blue in color. Each color highlighted the next, almost like some kind of crazy impressionist painting. But if you looked closely, you would see the colors moving around themselves slowly in a swirl-type pattern. Hank turned to the rest of the group as he said, "I'm not sure if we should use the ship to travel around with. If it became damaged, we would have a hard time getting back out." Agatha smiled at Hank as she said, "I can still feel a connection to magic here. We should be able to use our emergency exit if needed. But I'll want to test a few things first." Meow, meow, meow. Agatha reached over and scratched behind Ebony's ear as she said, "Yes, dear, that's fine. But just remember to stay close by." Meow. Agatha looked back at Hank as she said, "I'll go outside to test while you tell Steve and Peggy about Kong. Once we're done, we can start looking for your wife." Agatha tapped a rune on her suit, and a second later a helmet popped out, covering her head. As she moved towards the airlock with Ebony, Hank started to share the information he was given about Kong with them. After Agatha stepped out of the ship, she moved a small distance away as Ebony took off in a different direction to explore. Once a safe distance away, Agatha began to cast minor spells. After the first few worked correctly, she tested a few more advanced spells before she opened a portal. The other end of the portal opened up a few hundred feet from her. She then kept the portal open as she tested it with different spells. Once she was satisfied it was stable, she picked up a few weird-looking rock-type things from the ground and moved them through the portal with magic. Then she brought them back through the portal and examined them. While she tested out her magic, Ebony was running through the weird grassland, exploring everything they could. Within a few minutes, they were over a mile away from the ship and checking out an outcropping of rocks a short distance away. Ebony came this way first because they smelt something interesting in this area. As Ebony slowly crept through the grass towards the rocks, the smell became more potent. Around halfway to the rocks, Ebony froze in place as part of the rocks shifted. It was slight, but all the rocks shifted just a tiny amount, almost barely noticeable. Ebony, more cautious now, moved to the right before it moved in closer to the rocks. Again, Ebony froze in place as the rocks shifted again. This time it was more pronounced than before. Ebony shifted its position lower before it took another step forward. When the rocks didn't move, Ebony took another step forward. Again the rocks didn't move, so Ebony stepped forward cautiously again. But this time the rocks shifted. All of the rocks seemed to shake slightly for a few moments before it stopped. Ebony slowly laid down on the ground as it studied the rocks. As it watched the rocks, Ebony lightly tapped the ground in front of itself with its paw. The second its paw touched the ground, all the rocks shook again. Ebony was about to test the rocks again when a portal opened up next to them. Ebony turned to look at the portal and saw Agatha standing next to the ship with the others as she said, "Come along, Ebony. We're going to set out." Ebony pointed its paw in front of itself as it said, "Meow, meow, meow, meow. You ate before we left. Meow, 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 war." Agatha crossed her arms over her chest as she said, "I don't care how good it smells. You are not eating the first thing you found here. Now come along." Ebony glanced back at the rocks one more time before it jumped into the portal, which snapped closed behind it. A second later, the rocks moved again, but this time they expanded out into a rock-covered creature. The creature looked like an animal. Some rocks and possibly plants were all combined together. The creature was confused as it looked at the spot where its next meal was and found nothing. After a few moments of looking around, it returned to its dormant state and waited for its next meal. After Ebony landed in front of the group, Minato said, "If you give me and Tobarama a few minutes, we'll scout out the area around us." "It's fine. I came prepared," Hank said as he touched some buttons on a tablet he was carrying. A few seconds later, 10 drones about the size of large dogs shot out of the top of the ship. They extended wings before they flew off in different directions. Minato smiled slightly as he pulled out a handful of kunai and said, "We were about to do the same thing." Tobarama nodded in agreement as he showed a handful of kunai himself. Hank glanced at the kunai in curiosity as he asked, "Are those some kind of special sensors?" Minato tossed one at the ground and another a few hundred feet away before he disappeared in a flash. Everyone saw him at the other spot holding the kunai he just tossed before he reappeared next to them and said, "We can use them as teleportation beacons. They make scouting a quick task. Wouldn't the range be limited by how far you can throw them?" Hank asked. Minato shrugged as he said, I've thrown them up to 5 miles before. I've thrown them about 3 miles myself, Tobarama added. Everyone turned to look at Minato and Tobarama as Hank asked, "How is that even possible?" Steve nodded in agreement as he said, "I don't think I could throw anything even half a mile away." Hank glanced down at his tablet as Minato smiled and said, "You can with your new body, if you train enough." Hank tapped on his tablet a few times before he said, "Looks like one of the drones found something. Let's head towards it and check it out." When the others agreed, Hank placed a disc on the ship and shrunk it down. As he placed the ship into a small pouch on his waist, he said, "All right, follow me." The group formed up with Hank as the leader and started to move through the grassland area towards the drone. As they moved close to a small pile of rocks, Ebony hissed out, followed by a low meow. Agatha pointed at the rocks in the distance and said, "Ebony says those might be dangerous and smell delicious." Ebony nodded its head before they licked their lips. The group glanced over at the rock formation as Hank said, "Let's just go around them for now." The others nodded in agreement and made sure to stay away from all the rock formations they found. It took a little while before they came to the location the drone indicated. What they found was the edge of a cliff, and hundreds of feet below them was a portal into another area, which was a massive expanse of land with what looked like a green-colored river flowing through it. Hank pulled up his tablet and started to check it before he said in a frustrated tone, "This is going to take a while." Two other drones found more portals. "I can scout this one. Just hold on to this, and I'll be back when I'm finished," Minato said as he handed a kunai to Hank. Steve glanced at the portal before he said, "I don't think we should split up. What happens if you run into trouble and can't teleport back to us?" Minato smiled and tossed a kunai through the portal as he said, "Well, it's a good thing I don't currently have a body. I'm expendable." A second later, Minato disappeared, and the others couldn't see him through the portal at all. Tobarama shrugged as he said, "Honestly, this is probably the best way to explore this place. I'll take another portal and have a look around myself while you all stay here." The others couldn't really argue with the logic of Minato or Tobarama, so Hank pointed Tobarama towards another portal while his group explored the area around them. While Hank's team started to explore the quantum realm, Ezekiel was busy with Fury going over a few things. Well, at first it was just Ezekiel being berated for not sharing important information with Fury, but after that they had to figure out how to integrate the Valkyries into the base and training for them. Once Ezekiel finished with that, he went back home and changed back to his normal appearance. He let one of his clones cover for him at school today, and it was about time they came back. So he moved to his work computer to wait for his clone to come home. While he waited for that, he checked out a few things on Vibe and then moved to his website for his game. With the help of some people on Vibe and just dumb luck, the game has sold over 1 million copies now and even gained some attention from a few game companies wanting to buy the game. With all of Theo's protections set in place, no one knew he made the game or that the money was going to his parents' account. That isn't to say a few people tried to find out, but they were led in the wrong direction to a fake company and account. Theo had a couple clones working every day just to keep people in the dark about him being behind the game. His plan was to sell it to Vibe after it became more popular and place the demo mode on all the tablets and phones Tony was making. Speaking of Tony, Theo finally shared some of the alien technology they found on Chakra with him. To say he was happy would be an understatement. Tony didn't sleep for almost 3 days straight after the tech was dropped off. Since then, Tony has been testing and deconstructing everything, figuring out how it all works. Within a day, he already figured out a new way to increase a cell tower's signal strength to cover almost 20 miles with a single tower. For a lower bandwidth frequency, 20 miles is nothing, but they were using a higher frequency signal, which normally traveled a lot shorter distance. Once Tony figured that out, he asked Theo to redo the coding the cell towers would use to handle the extra traffic and bandwidth. With just that one little thing, Tony's cellular service will be able to cover all of the US with no issue. Tony already had a new branch of Stark Tech building cell towers everywhere in the world, and with the slight change to the technology, it wasn't hard to retrofit towers already in place. Actually, it made less work for the company, since they mostly bought out towers already in place or bought some space on the tower itself, if a company didn't want to sell the tower to Stark. 00128. The Quantum Realm, bigger than it sounds. After being gone for a few days, Agatha contacted Tao with the bracelet she wore. Since that was designed for their escape plan, Tao opened a portal to the Quantum Realm. After Agatha and Tao talked about the situation, Tao closed the portal and then sent Theo a message using her smartphone. By the next day of getting the message, Theo showed up to Genosha in his Ezekiel disguise carrying a backpack and made his way to Tao. Ezekiel placed a backpack on the ground as he said, "I thought this might happen." Tao nodded in agreement as she said, "From what you described of the place, I think it might take them a few months to find her, if not longer." Ezekiel nodded as he asked, "Can you open a portal to them?" Tao nodded as she said, "It's not hard to do now that we made contact. Give me a moment to find them." Tao wove a spell together, and after about a minute, she opened up a portal next to Agatha. Agatha glanced through the portal and smiled as she asked, "You wouldn't want to trade places, would you? I'm not sure if I want to stay here till we find Hank's wife." Tao shook her head as she said, "No thanks." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "You were the one who volunteered to go in the first place." "I know, but this could take months. Every time Minato and Tobarama come back, they tell us they found even more branches to explore." Agatha said with a sigh. Ezekiel lifted up the backpack and passed it through the portal as he said, "Don't worry, it shouldn't take that long. This is something I just finished making to help with the search." Agatha took the backpack as she asked, "How is this backpack going to help in the search? I barely feel any magic power in it." "Just give the backpack to Hank. He'll know what it's for since he helped to make it. I'm also sending clones to help." Ezekiel smiled before he made a hand sign, and over 50 clones appeared around him. Ezekiel glanced at the clones as he said, "You know what to do." The clones all nodded before they moved through the portal. Once they were on the other side, they moved towards Hank and the others who were currently looking over his tablet. Agatha glanced at the clones before she asked, "You plan to use your clones for scouting?" "Yes. All of them will be exploring different places till they run out of chakra. Once I receive the memories, I should be able to map out the quantum realm quickly. But I don't think it will be needed if Hank uses the backpack," Ezekiel said with a smile. "So why didn't we do this in the first place, or give us the backpack before we left?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "There was no way Hank would wait for me to find her with clones, and I hadn't finished up the backpack yet. I've had clones working on that thing for months after Hank gave it to me. But I didn't expect to use it now. It was meant for after we found his wife, so I just finished it an hour ago." Agatha nodded in understanding before she lifted up the backpack and asked, "What exactly is this thing?" Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Give it to Hank. He'll show you what it is. I wouldn't want to ruin the surprise." Agatha glanced at Tao as she said, "Increase his training while I'm gone." Tao nodded as she said, "I was already planning to, since you won't be around to help." Ezekiel started to sweat as he said, I think I hear my mom calling me for dinner. Gotta go." Before his afterimage disappeared from view, Tao and Agatha looked at each other before they started to chuckle. Once they stopped, Tao asked, "Do you need anything special while you're stuck there? Decent food would be nice. Hank brought some MREs on the ship, but they aren't great. Works if you're hungry, but that's about it. Pretty sure Steve is the only one who thinks they're good." Agatha said. Tao nodded in understanding before she said, "The backpack should take care of that issue, I think." "You know what's in the backpack?" "No, but Ezekiel said it was to help out with your long-term stay in the quantum realm." Tao said, "Then I better take this over to Hank. I'll contact you in a few days unless something comes up first." Agatha said. As Tao started to close the portal, she said, "Good luck." "Thanks," Agatha said as the portal snapped closed. Afterwards, she moved towards the group as the last few clones of Ezekiel disappeared to explore different portals in the quantum realm. Agatha handed the backpack to Hank as she said, "Ezekiel said to give you this." Hank smiled as he took the backpack and said, "Great, with this we can save more time." The others looked at the backpack as Steve asked, "What's it do?" "Give me a moment and I'll show you," Hank said as he moved away from the group. After he was 100 feet or so away, he placed the backpack on the ground and opened up the top before he pulled something out and placed it on the ground. He pulled his tablet around and connected a cable to it before he typed on it for a moment. A few seconds later, the thing on the ground expanded rapidly into a very large building. After that, Hank disconnected his tablet and picked up the backpack before he turned around and waved the others to come over. When the others were close, Hank said, "This will be our base from now on. No more moving around." Peggy glanced at the building before she asked, Why are we going to stop here? Can't we just carry this around in the backpack? Hank shook his head as he said, "Come inside and I'll show you why." It took a few minutes to get into the building through a bunch of decontamination features. Once inside, Steve noticed some weird runes carved into a few things and asked Agatha, "Did you and Tao help make this?" Agatha shook her head as she said, "No, Ezekiel made this himself as far as I know." Agatha checked the runes by running her hand over them and injecting a little bit of magic into each one. After a few moments, she said, "The spell itself works well, but the runes are lacking." Not bad for his first try, though. "What do the runes actually do?" Peggy asked. As Agatha pushed the button on her helmet and it collapsed into her suit, she said, "It's an advanced cleansing spell. Think of it like the decontamination area we just went through, but with magic." The others copied her and removed their helmets as Hank said, "I'll give you a quick tour as we head to the main hub of this place." Hank started to walk down the entrance hallway to the only crossing point and said, "I helped Ezekiel design this place. It was meant to be completed after I found Janet, but it looks like Ezekiel finished it early. It was made to help explore the quantum realm and map it out completely if possible." Hank pointed down a hallway to the left and said, "That should be the dorms, armory, and kitchen area." Hank then pointed to the hallway to the right and said, "That should be a recreation area, gym, theater, and library. I'm pretty sure the gym has a pool and sauna too. Do we really need all this stuff?" Steve asked. Hank started walking again as he shrugged and said, "Ezekiel said we needed it in the facility. I wasn't going to argue with him since he paid for everything and was helping me find Janet." They moved down the main entrance to a sealed door which opened as Hank stepped within 10 feet of it. Inside was a decent-sized room with a large screen on the far wall, while a comfy-looking chair sat in the middle of the room. Against the entrance wall was another set of normal-looking chairs. As Hank moved towards the chair in the middle of the room, he said, "Take a seat and I'll show you what this place is meant for." As everyone sat down, Peggy asked, "Is it me? Or did the building look a lot bigger from the outside?" Hank adjusted his chair as he typed on his tablet for a few moments before he said, "Only 30% of the building is meant for our use. The rest of it is designed for its main purpose." The large screen in the room powered on, and they could see what looked like a dark hangar bay. A moment later, the top of the hangar started to open, and everyone could see a hangar full of drones. Hank typed on his tablet, and after the hangar opened up, they could see some satellite towers rise out of the building in certain areas. After that, the drones started to power on, and then small groups started to leave the hangar and fly away. Hank finished typing before he pointed at the satellite towers as he said, "The main reason we are staying here is because of those. With the 10 portals close to us, this will be one of the best places to make use of those towers." "Won't the drones lose signal once they pass through a portal, like the drones from the ship?" Peggy asked. Hank shook his head and pointed at a group of 10 drones leaving the hangar as he said, "Ezekiel made those drones with portals in mind. One drone will stay on this side of the portal connected to another drone with a cable that will travel to the other side of the portal." Hank typed on his tablet to show the view from a different set of drones. It showed what he was talking about before he said, "Now the other drones will talk to that drone and explore the area. If another portal is found, another set of drones expand the network and another group of drones is called in to explore it. As long as we don't run out of drones, we should be able to explore every portal we come across, and I can check it all over from this room." Agatha stood up from her chair as she said, "Well, if that's the case, I'm going to check out the kitchen area and eat some real food." "Meow. Of course I'll feed you too," Agatha said before she left the room. Peggy and Steve shared a glance before Peggy said, "We're going to go check out the rest of the place. Just call if you need something." Hank waved them off as he said, "It's fine. I'll be here for a while getting everything going." As Hank settled into his chair, he sent commands to different sets of drones. He had a pretty good grasp of the area around them already and sent the drones to the portals he knew about. As he finished setting the first set of commands, he said to himself, "Don't worry, Janet. I'll find you soon." 00129. Taking care of a future villain, while Hank and his team continued to explore the quantum realm in search of his wife. Theo went back to work on a project he was neglecting for the past couple years. He originally planned to build a massive complex in Brooklyn to act as Vibe's headquarters. But buying up all the land took a while, and only a month ago the last property was purchased. even though the area he wanted was mostly industrial and warehouse space near his father's business. A lot of people didn't want to sell at first, even when he offered them more than the property was worth. For anyone who didn't want to sell for a reasonable offer, Theo did some research. Most of them just wanted more money because they thought the property was worth more. But most of those properties were owned by large companies, so Theo did the only reasonable thing and stole the properties instead. It wasn't hard to do either, since the companies were so big the properties just disappeared into nothing, like the company never owned them in the first place. The people who knew about the properties firsthand? Theo sent a clone to hide the memories about each property. With Theo taking that route, he was able to claim about 60% of the area he wanted. As for the rest of the properties, Theo paid out the owners the asking price plus 30%. A few argued for more when they realized someone was buying up all the property in the area. So Theo dealt with those people on a person-to-person basis. If they were decent people, he would gladly pay them more. For the people who weren't, Theo would take the property for market price or less. Depending on how bad of a person they were, would depend on how much Theo would give them for the property. The two people Theo found to be slumlords, well, they ended up losing all of their properties and disappeared, never to be seen again. Theo was planning to transfer the properties to a family member, but everyone close to them wasn't much better. So Theo took over the properties, found a good company to manage them, and then sunk a bunch of money into fixing up the buildings outside of the area he was going to demolish. He also helped move the tenants from the area he was going to demo to other buildings he was fixing up. As for the area in Brooklyn that Theo bought up, he ran into one small issue. Most of the buildings in the area he bought up had current tenants that needed to be dealt with. All of them had some form of lease or rental agreement for at least a year or more. So Theo went to each of them with clones and offered a cash incentive to close out their lease agreement. He even offered to cover the moving cost for them if they agreed. Most of them took the offer, but there were a few who didn't want to move their business. When Theo looked into the few holdouts, all of them were older and just like the area they were in. So Theo went to each of them and offered to buy out their businesses. At first, they didn't want to sell, but Theo pointed out that when their lease agreement was up, they would have to move no matter what. With that, all but one person agreed to sell their business to Theo, and he didn't lowball them either. They were all just hard-working people with a small business, so Theo paid them 3 times what the business was worth. As for the last holdout, they didn't want to sell because the business was a front. With its location close to the water, it was used for smuggling. Freighter ships would come into port in New York, and before the ship was searched, they would offload certain cargo onto a small boat. That boat would then cruise across the harbor over to Brooklyn and enter an old sewer tunnel, which went underneath the building in question. It was a pretty smooth operation, and if Theo wasn't trying to clear out that whole area for his project, he never would have found it. It didn't take long for Theo to take care of the whole operation, just a few clones over a week, and Theo caught everyone involved with the operation. They mostly smuggled drugs, but they would also move cash, stolen art, and a few other things sometimes. As for dealing with the underlings involved, it depended on how bad they were. The few he found that were just trying to survive and hadn't done anything serious yet, he gave them a second chance. For the people Theo considered bad, he just loaded them up with a bag of drugs and then put them under a ninjutsu that made them think they were going to deliver it to a client. The client was a police station. As for the ringleaders, well, they were all pieces of work. So Theo made sure they disappeared and took over anything they owned and sold it for a quick profit. Since all of that was now completed, Theo needed to start his next step of the project. He needed to demo all of the buildings, and he knew just the person for the job. Adrian Toombs. He was currently running a small salvage company, which he used to support his wife and young daughter. He also had the potential to one day become known as the villain named the Vulture if Theo wasn't careful. So Theo figured the best way to stop it was to help the guy out. Theo's first order of business was to use his Ezekiel persona and set up a meeting with Adrian at one of the buildings he purchased in the Brooklyn area. The morning of the meeting, Adrian woke up a little groggy to the smell of breakfast being made. He smiled to himself. Doris, his loving wife, got up early again to make sure he had something for breakfast besides a cup of coffee. After getting ready, Adrian went to the kitchen and found his wife and daughter. His daughter just finished setting the table as his wife finished cooking. Adrian moved towards the coffee pot as he said, "How are my lovely ladies doing this morning?" Doris turned off the stove as she said, "We're good. How are you?" Did you get enough sleep? As Adrian poured himself a cup of coffee, he said, I'll be fine after some coffee. Dad, look what I drew in class. His daughter Elizabeth said as she pointed to the fridge. Adrian glanced at the picture and smiled before he said, It's beautiful, honey. Now come here and give me my morning hug. Adrian set his coffee down and then picked up his daughter in a hug. Afterwards, he gave his wife a hug and said, Thanks for making breakfast. Doris kissed his cheek before she said, You're welcome. Now let's eat. You have a big day today meeting with a potential client. As Adrian sat down, he said, It's just a meeting. I doubt much will come out of it. Doris shook her head as she said, You have to think positive thoughts and positive things will happen in return. Adrian couldn't help but smile. His wife always said that, but so far it didn't help. They were barely scraping by as he tried to get his small business off the ground, while his wife worked a full-time job. But he wasn't one to argue with his wife, since she was one of the smartest people he knew. He nodded his head and said, All right, sweetie, I'll only think positive thoughts about the meeting. Good, Doris said before they started to eat breakfast and shared some small talk. After breakfast, Doris took their daughter to school and Adrian headed to Brooklyn for his meeting with his potential client. Ezekiel was seated on the steps of a building with Shursway chatting as a beat-up quad cab truck pulled up. On the side of the truck was the company name, Tomb Salvage, with a phone number. The man who stepped out of the truck was wearing a set of coveralls and looked like a younger version of his movie counterpart. As Adrian came around his truck, he studied the two young men seated on the steps of the building. Both of them looked familiar to him, but he just couldn't place them. As he moved towards them, Ezekiel stood up and extended his hand as he said, Mr. Toombs, I'm Ezekiel and this is my assistant Shursway. It's nice to meet you. As he shook each of their hands, Adrian said, It's nice to meet you too. And just Adrian is fine. Adrian took a quick glance at the building as he asked, So what can I help you with? Ezekiel smiled as he said, A few things actually. Let's head upstairs, and I'll show you what I want to hire you for. They didn't really talk as they moved to the top of the building and came out on the roof. Near one edge of the roof was a set of sawhorses with a piece of wood laid across them, making a table. Once they neared the makeshift table, Shursway pulled out some papers from a tube that was resting on the table. As he started to roll them out, Ezekiel asked, Adrian, how would you feel about expanding your business? Expanding my business? How big is the salvage job you have? Adrian asked. Ezekiel pointed to the paperwork on the table as he said, Well, salvage is only one portion of the job. The main portion of the job would be demolition, but you could also run salvage on it. Adrian looked down at the paper and realized it was a map of the area, and every building was marked with an X for demolition. After taking a few moments, Adrian looked up at Ezekiel and said, I think you called the wrong guy. Did I? Ezekiel glanced at Shursway as he asked, It said Tomb Salvage on his truck, right? As Shursway nodded his head, Adrian said, Look, I appreciate the offer, but I really think you have the wrong guy. I only do salvage, and even if I wanted to run just salvage on this operation, I only have 2 employees, my truck and a trailer. Ezekiel nodded in understanding before he said, So you just need to hire more staff and buy some equipment. It's not that simple. I don't have the money to do that, and no one would give me a loan to do something like that. Adrian said, Hypothetically, if you could get a loan, would you want the job? Ezekiel asked with a smile. Of course I would. Ezekiel nodded before he asked, What about the demolition? Would you do it if you had the men and equipment? Adrian glanced at the map again before he said, I don't see why not. But that would never happen. You're talking about millions of dollars just for the equipment and tools. Then the business license, special work permits for the demolition work, and then enough money to pay the employees for a job that could take at least a year. So what, like 10 or 20 million? Ezekiel asked. Adrian kept looking at the map as he nodded and then said, Maybe a little less, but yeah. Ezekiel smirked as he said, Well, then I guess we have a deal. Adrian's head snapped up and he looked at Ezekiel as he asked, What? We have a deal. I'll have a contract drawn up for a loan and the project I want you to do by the end of the day. Ezekiel said as he smirked. Adrian was dazed as he asked, You're joking with me, right? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, No, I'm not. Why? Adrian asked. Why what? Adrian glanced at the map again as he asked, Why are you offering something like this to me? You could go to any company and they would jump at the chance to bid on this job. Because I did my research. You might not have a big company yet, but everyone who you've worked for has nothing but good things to say about you. Ezekiel said before he smiled again. And you know what that tells me? Ezekiel asked. That I do good work? Ezekiel nodded as he said, that's one part of it. The other is it's only a matter of time before your business grows a lot bigger. I'm offering you a way to do that sooner. The question is, are you willing to do it? 00130. Everyone has their own priorities. After Adrian agreed to work with Ezekiel, a contract was drafted a few days later with a few clauses in place. The first clause was the loan Ezekiel was giving Adrian for his business was an advanced payment for the overall job. The second clause was if the job was completed on time, the company would receive a bonus payment. The last clause was a signing bonus for Adrian himself. Ezekiel gave the man $500,000 for accepting the job. When Adrian read over the contract with the help of his wife, who was currently a paralegal, they both had the same thought. Ezekiel was crazy. But Adrian still signed the contract with his wife's blessing. After Ezekiel accepted the contract back, he said, with your signing bonus, I would recommend buying a house in Brooklyn close to the project. Adrian glanced at his wife, who said, we've always talked about buying a house somewhere just outside the city limits where it's less crowded. Ezekiel nodded as he said, you can do that if you want, but it would advise against it for 2 reasons. Ezekiel smiled as he held up one finger and said, the first is your commute time into the city. You would be looking at an hour drive or more just to do anything in the city. Longer if you're coming out to Brooklyn to oversee the project. Ezekiel raised another finger as he said, you would be making a terrible financial decision. Adrian shared a look with his wife before he asked, what makes you say that? Because of the job you're doing here for me and what will be built here afterwards. Hold on a second and I'll show you. Ezekiel pulled out his tablet and typed on it for a moment before he placed it on the table. He then pulled out a small device with a cable and plugged it into the tablet before he hit a button on the side of it. Adrian and his wife jumped in shock as a realistic 3D model appeared in the air, just above the device. After getting over his shock, Adrian asked in wonder, how did you do that? Ezekiel smirked as he said, this is just some technology, one made with the help of a friend. He designed the hardware portion and I programmed the software. Who's your friend, Tony Stark? Doris asked jokingly. Yup. Ezekiel said with a smile. Adrian jumped up from his seat and pointed at Ezekiel as he said, that's why you look so familiar. You were all over the news with Tony a while back. You beat up all those people in that Vegas casino. Doris opened her mouth in shock and wanted to say something but couldn't. Adrian, who was still standing, asked, are you really a mutant? I mean, you look normal to me. Aren't mutants supposed to look different? Doris recovered quickly and slapped her husband's arm as she said, you shouldn't talk like that. It's rude. Adrian looked a little embarrassed as he sat back down and said, what? It's just a question. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, Doris is right. It's rude, but it's fine. I personally don't mind it, but I wouldn't recommend doing that to anyone else. As for your question, yes, I'm a metahuman, which is the proper term to use for someone like me. Adrian smiled sheepishly as he said, sorry, I got a little excited since I've never met a metahuman before. Ezekiel waved it off as he said, it's not a big deal. And for the record, you've probably met a few metahumans before and never knew it. Really? Ezekiel shrugged as he said, there's a good chance. A lot of them look normal, just like me. Do you mind if I ask you a personal question? Adrian asked. Go ahead. Adrian frowned a little as he asked, you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but what's it like? What do you mean? Well, what's it like being a metahuman? As Adrian finished, his wife slapped his arm again as she shot him a glare before she turned to Ezekiel and said, you don't have to answer that. Ezekiel started to laugh for a few moments before he said, man, that was good. And here I thought Tony was the only person who would ask a stupid question like that. Adrian was hit again by his wife as Ezekiel shook his head before he smiled and said, you know, I'm just as human as you are. I just have a little something extra is all. Does it make me special? I guess, but you could say the same thing for anyone else. Everyone is different and unique when you really take the time to think about it. Maybe they don't have powers, but that doesn't make them any less unique or special. Adrian and Doris nodded along before Adrian said, I never really thought about it like that before, but it makes a lot of sense now that you mention it. Most people don't, but that's fine. Also, we got off topic. Ezekiel said as he pointed back at the hologram floating over the table. Adrian rubbed the back of his head as he said, Sorry. Ezekiel smiled as he said, It's fine. But like I was saying, this area will be the future site of a few projects I am working on. But one of the main ones is the headquarters of Vibe. Vibe? You mean that website that has videos? Adrian asked. Doris shook her head as she said, It's more than a website. It's a whole platform and it's growing bigger by the day. Ezekiel nodded before he said, Our current user base is around 55 million people. But in the next 6 months, that user base should at least triple. It really depends on how an upcoming project goes. Adrian glanced at his wife as he asked, Is it really that popular? I don't know the actual numbers, but I don't see why not. Some videos have tens of millions of views. Doris said. Ezekiel nodded and moved the hologram around to show an overview of the area and marked a few spots as he said, It is, which is why I said you should buy a house around this area. Within the next 5 to 10 years, all the properties around this area will explode in value. I'm also slowing buying up more properties in Brooklyn so I can add more to this project down the road. Adrian shared a glance with his wife before he said, We'll have to think about it, but thanks for the advice. Doris nodded in agreement before her watch beeped a few times, which she glanced down at before she said, I don't want to be rude, but we have to pick our daughter up from the babysitter in half an hour. Ezekiel nodded as he said, It's fine. The main reason for our meeting was getting the contract signed. Adrian stood up and extended his hand as he said, Thank you again for giving me this opportunity. Ezekiel stood up and shook his hand as he said, You're welcome. After shaking Doris's hand, Ezekiel said, Also, I'm not sure if you have plans tonight, but I'd like to invite you to dinner. Adrian glanced at his wife before he said, I'm not sure if we can. Our babysitter doesn't work past 5. Oh, you don't need a babysitter. You can bring your daughter with you. Ezekiel said, She's a little young though. I'm not sure how well she would do in a restaurant. Doris said. Ezekiel smiled as he said, It'll be fine. I'm going to bring a kid myself, so it's not a big deal. Oh, you have a kid? But you're so young. Doris said. Ezekiel smiled as he said, I just look young. As for kids, I have a couple, but it's a complicated situation with them currently. Doris frowned as she thought there might be a custody battle going on before she said, Sorry to hear that, but hopefully it all works out for you and your kids. Ezekiel nodded as he said, I'm sure it will. Ezekiel reached down and turned off the hologram projector as he asked, So can I pick you guys up around 6? Doris shared a quick glance with her husband who nodded before she said, Sure, 6 o'clock sounds great. Ezekiel picked up his tablet as Doris asked, Is there a dress code we need to worry about? No, it's going to be a really relaxed evening, so just wear comfortable clothes. Ezekiel said. After Adrian and his wife left, Ezekiel locked up the building he was using and then portaled to his training room. Once there, he changed back to normal and texted someone, Get ready. I'll pick you up in an hour and a half. A thumbs up along with a grinning emoji was the response. Theo shook his head before he moved upstairs to his room and had his clone dispel before he walked upstairs to hang out with his family. As he walked into the kitchen, his dad said, Perfect timing. Come help me with dinner. What do you need me to do? Theo asked as he walked over to his dad. Jacob was in the process of setting out some bowls on the counter as he said, I was thinking of homemade mashed potatoes to go with the fried chicken I'm making. Can you wash and peel them? I already have a pot of water on and heating up. Theo moved to the kitchen pantry as he said, Sounds good to me, Dad. Theo pulled out a bag of potatoes from the pantry and moved to the kitchen sink where a little step stool was. After he stepped on it, he could easily reach and use the sink. So Theo poured out the potatoes into the sink and turned on the water. After that, Theo tossed the bag into the trash can underneath the sink and then pulled out a peeling knife from a drawer. As Theo started to wash and peel the potatoes, Jacob began to hum as he pulled out a large mixing bowl from the fridge with chicken that soaked in buttermilk overnight. As Jacob started to prepare chicken pieces by coating it in a flour and breadcrumb mix, he broke out into a song. Well, it's all right. Riding around in the breeze. Well, it's all right. As Jacob started to sing, Theo began to hum along, knowing the song pretty well, since it was a favorite of his dad's. If you live the life you please, well, it's all right. Doing the best you can, well, it's all right. As Jacob began the next part of the song, Theo also started to sing along as he peeled potatoes. As long as you lend a hand. Jacob smiled before he sang the next part as Theo added the chorus. You can sit around and wait for the phone to ring. At the end of the line, waiting for someone to tell you everything. At the end of the line, sit around and wonder what tomorrow will bring. At the end of the line, maybe a diamond ring. Theo was in sync with Jacob over the next few verses as they sang out, well, it's all right. Even if they say you're wrong. Well, it's all right. Sometimes you gotta be strong. Well, it's all right. As long as you got somewhere to lay. Well, it's all right. Every day is Judgment Day. Over the next couple of minutes, Theo and Jacob became lost preparing food and singing until the end of the song when they heard clapping. Both of them turned around to see Daniel, Isaac, and Millie as they stood by the kitchen entrance, each one with a smile on. Daniel looked down at Millie as she asked, "What do you think, Millie? Does your dad and Theo have a music career ahead of them?" Millie shook her head as she said, "No, Daddy needs to make me cookies."